Okay, so thank you for coming to the Blue Swan today. We are very, very lucky to have Larry Namer, who is the founder of Entertainment Networks, entertainment mogul. And on that note, please say whatever you'd like about yourself and your business.
Sure. Yeah, Larry Namer, best known in this country as the co-founder of Entertainment Television, which has brought you everything from Howard Stern to Kardashians and stuff like that. But I've also built media companies and one in Russia, and I currently have a media company in China. And with COVID, started doing stuff here in the U.S. again, mainly things that have a social impact component to them. So I've been pretty busy and staying out of trouble.
Thanks. And so on some of the other podcasts, you've mentioned sort of weighing different geographics in terms of your media portfolio. And so you've talked about how Hollywood is a mindset and that it's important not to neglect, the South American, Russian, and Chinese markets when it comes to managing a media company. And so do you have anything you'd want to talk about in terms of that?
Sure. If you look back 100 years ago, if you wanted to make any kind of video content creation, you really had to come to Hollywood to do it. You needed big sound stages, you needed very expensive equipment. But as technology kept bringing down the cost and therefore the barriers, you started to find that all these countries, instead of buying stuff from the US or coming to the US to make it, would start making their own programming. So now, if you look just 20 years ago, the U.S. was the dominant force in the theatrical film market or in the TV production market. Now, 20 years later, the U.S. is only 30% of global box office and stuff. So you have China and South America, and even Africa has become a very vibrant market for different stuff. So, my advice to people is you really need to think of whatever your projects are more on a global level than on just what Hollywood would be interested in.
Thanks. And so there are two emerging paradigms in entertainment, and those are AI and holograms. And so with AI, it's now easier to get something done, 80% more quickly. And so if it used to take 5 days to think of a TV show, you can get that done with about 80% accuracy in far less time, and then allocate that to whatever you feel like doing. And holograms in education are making it a little bit more interesting so people aren't just sitting in a lecture rolling their eyes. And I'm wondering how you see those two forces being integrated as the LLMs are rolling out more and more powerful models, and the studios such as Sony and Netflix are beginning to force litigation against Chinese companies like Seedance.
Yeah, well, you have the situation. AI can be an incredibly valuable tool for any creator anywhere because again it helps bring down the cost and therefore the barriers to entry so that more creative people anywhere in the world could have the ability to create. The problem we have particularly in this country is our legislators or our lawmakers basically don't understand AI, and they've taken the position of putting their head in the sand and making believe it'll go away. Well, it's not going away. It's going to be here. The big problem we have, there are no guardrails. There's no rules or regulations that let bad people know that they can't do bad things without consequence. And I always give people this example, and I try and simplify stuff as much as I can because most people don't understand AI or what the implications are. But, if a 12-year-old kid were to come to me and said, hey, give me the keys to the car, I feel like driving. Okay. You can't do it. You're not allowed to drive at 12 years old. But then when you reach driving age, you got to take a course. You then have to take a test and then you could drive, but you have to follow the rules of the road or there are consequences for not doing it. With AI, we haven't built those barriers in yet. So it's kind of the Wild West. People just don't know what the rules are. So they just do whatever they feel like. and then eventually people have to take them to court or sue or, or do things like that. So sooner or later, the laws and regulations will catch up. I think California in this country is probably the furthest along in getting that stuff set up, but we still have a long way to go.
Thanks. And so you're very well known for calling the shots on two of the most well-known media personalities to this day, which are Howard Stern and Kim Kardashian. And so Howard Stern is arguably the most prolific radio host in the world right now. He also was initially one of the most heavily and frequently fined by the FTC. And so I'm curious to know sort of what you saw and how you managed to call the shot on the bullseye of Howard Stern.
Sure. I mean, actually, it was kind of interesting because we met Howard totally by accident in an elevator in a building in New York City, and he was telling us about his radio show. And my attitude at first was, "Gee, I don't know how to tell this guy that radio's been dead for 40 years." But eventually, we went and looked at the show, and I went back and told our team, I said, "Hey, I want to put cameras in this guy's radio studio," and they were like, "Larry, when you came up with the idea for Talk Soup, we thought you were out of your mind. You want to do a TV show that made fun of TV shows. Now we're totally convinced you're out of your mind because radio, who cares about radio?" And I basically said, "You guys don't understand that there used to be a TV show in the US that was very popular called WKRP in Cincinnati." I said, "The Howard Stern Show is the reality TV version of KRP in Cincinnati." I said, "Don't think of it as a radio show. Think of it as an ensemble comedy." And it was. I mean, it was more than just Howard. He had a whole cast of characters around him that kept your interest.
No, it's been a fascinating journey. He's gone from, getting polygraphed about sticking his tongue in someone's mouth during the first couple of
Oh,
episodes to
yeah.
interviewing Lady Gaga. And so massive, massive transformation over the last 40 or so years. And so on one of your other podcasts, the host tried to gauge your personality by asking if you were a whiskey or a vodka person, whether you liked it neat or on the rocks. And your answer was neat vodka, which is a very, very, very intense answer. And back in the day, you also talked about how the Russian mafia had girlfriends who really liked your show, and they liked it so much that they would give you tomatoes during a food shortage. And so back when I was an undergrad as a Russian major, my friends and I used to binge watch this YouTube video called Brett Kreisner's The Machine, which is about this guy who passes 3 years of college Russian studying abroad by getting drunk with the Russian mafia. And that was literally rolled out into a full-length movie. But with that in mind, do you have a chance to talk about some of the less orthodox aspects of growing a business, such as dealing with the Russian Brotherhood in the motherland?
Sure. When we were there, well, we were there for a whole bunch of years, but it was basically those years of transition from Soviet Union to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and there were lots of problems there. Basically the government collapsed and there was nobody in charge. So it was truly the Wild West. And you had the politicians and the Gorbachevs and then the Yeltsins, in charge at the beginning. You could argue about the level of corruption there, but you also then had the mafia guys, which formed so it was really challenging to figure out who was really in charge there. But my feeling was that these people had so many problems. There were food shortages, and you had to stand online to get a pack of cigarettes for 3.5 hours. And I just said we got to give them something just they could sit down in front of a TV set and have a beer and get their mind off of today's problems. So we brought soap operas in, and we had a soap opera there called Santa Barbara that ended up being the number one TV show in Russia for 11 years, 5 days a week. And it was very traditional soap opera and stuff, but it was so popular that we were finding 80% of people with television sets were watching this show because, I mean, which is crazy. They get an 80% market share. And Yeah, but their choice was they could either watch our show or watch bad news. There wasn't much of a choice there. Even to the point where when the show would be on, like at 7 o'clock at night, the women in the stores would literally lock the door to the stores and let the customers line up on the street until the show was over, and then they'd open the door and let the customers back in. There was even a thing that was actually reported in the New York Times where Boris Yeltsin wanted to preempt the show so that he could do a political announcement. And basically, people said that if he preempts the show, they'll burn down the White House with him in it. He had to move his political speech so that the show would go on at the right time. It was incredibly powerful, and you had the all the girlfriends of all these big mafia guys loved the show, and particularly one character, a guy who played Mason, who was an actor named Lane Davies, and they would always want to know what's going on. Did he love this girl? And are they going to break up? And they wanted to always know what's going to happen next week. And whenever they'd see me out at a restaurant or something, they would go, Larry, tell us what happens to the Mason character next week so we could be a hero with the girlfriend. And I go, no, I can't. I'm not allowed to do that. I can't tell you what's going to be on. And, again, food shortage time. They would go, well, you like tomatoes, don't you? And I went, yeah, I love tomatoes. They go, tell us what happens next week. And you'll have tomatoes delivered tomorrow. And literally, they would deliver stuff to the house, and I would eat good, and I would tell them what was happening next week.
Awesome. And so a lot has changed since the earlier days of, jumping the fence of the Academy Awards onto the red carpet and raising 2.5 million instead of 6 to 100 back when the equipment and the cost of growing a media network was much, much higher. And so can you describe sort of the impact of going from that stage to where you are today on your personality and your perspective on life and anything else in between?
Well, we could only raise $2.5 million. We weren't smart enough to know that wasn't enough, so we just kept going and we kind of figured it out. I actually had a friend who was teaching radio, television, film at University of Texas in Austin, and I called him up and said, Brian, do you have any kids who need intern jobs for the summer? And he said, yeah, we had a lot of trouble placing this year. I said, send me all you got. So, a lot of people don't realize he's now in 142 countries. And I've heard the last valuation is up a little over 10 billion. But he started with 11 employees and 31 interns. So we had to be very, very inventive and very creative in how we deployed that $2.5 million because that's all we had. And but for me, it was kind of interesting because we spent 3.5 years raising the first 10 cents. And people were always like, you can't do that, it's impossible, you're not Rupert Murdoch, you're not Disney, whatever. And I would always be coming up with all my crazy ideas because we weren't part of the media mainstream. So when we did Talk Soup, I told everybody, I said I want to do a TV show that makes fun of TV shows, and they were like, "That Larry, that's crazy. Nobody will ever go along." Well, Talk Soup ran 26 years. Um, and then we went from Talk Soup to Howard, then E Hollywood True Story, and Wild on E, and more recently, obviously, the Kardashians. Um, so because we weren't part of the mainstream media world, we just took a lot of chances because I guess we didn't know better. We weren't afraid of the big guys coming down on us or whatever. So it's really helped me think outside the box and understanding. I got a good education in the way big media companies work because eventually we took some of them in as partners. Um, but we learned what to do and what not to do. I mean, I've been successful in Russia and China, and people are amazed. They say, "How could you, survive in those kind of hostile environments and stuff?" And a lot of it has to do with upbringing, and the fact that we weren't part of mainstream media, so we didn't know what we were supposed to do.
Thanks. And so starting a company, regular involves, 14 to 16 hour days and a certain degree of personal sacrifice. And so you've mentioned previously, how you came to a personal and professional epiphany during your son's struggle with brain cancer. And so one of the things I never mentioned much until now is that when I first signed a contract to try and sell the company for 8.5 million in 2022, which became 13, I literally I had a tumor at that time. And
Mhm.
that sort of going through that sort of a health crisis, it creates a different perspective on work and life. And so, if it's not too much to ask, would you mind kind of mentioning sort of how that may or may not have shifted your perspective?
Oh, sure. Again, being in the startup world is always you work in those 14 and 16-hour days, and that's kind of the main thing in your life, and you ignore family and friends and stuff more than you should. But that was just kind of the way it was. But then when my son John, my older son, his mom and I were together. She called me one day and said, I think John is either drinking or doing drugs. And I'm going, why? She goes, well, I'm watching him try and do his homework and he can't get the pencil on the line. He can't focus. I said, I don't know. Maybe the kid needs glasses. Take him to an eye doctor. And she did. She said, yeah, they said he needs glasses. And then a week later, she said, you know what? He's still having problems. That's not the issue. And, I said, well, maybe they gave him the wrong prescription. Take him back to the eye doctor. And then the eye doctor said, well, he's got a muscle disorder in his eye. And so she did a bunch of research. And, the kid's really lucky that he had a mom that was so diligent. And, and she called him back and said, listen, 80% of what you're saying makes sense, but 20% doesn't. I want you to test them. And the eye doctor was like, "Yeah, putting this kid through it for no reason. I know what I'm doing. It's a muscle disorder in the eye." Ends up they test. She insists on being tested, and they do, and they find he has this very rare form of cancer, brain cancer, that normally it affects teenage boys when the change of puberty unleashes something that was latent in the body for years. And and so we go to the doctor, the specialist, and he goes, well, in one sense you're very lucky because that we usually don't diagnose these kids till autopsy, because they always get misdiagnosed as a muscle disorder in the eye. And what happens is the tumor grows over the duct in the brain, and these kids die of brain failure before they die of the cancer. And he said, but the bad part is we never had a kid go more than 6 months from diagnosis to autopsy. Um, and but they did say they had an experimental program that was being administered out of a hospital in New York, and that we got John into that. And so he had experimental surgery where they rerouted the duct in the brain so that as the tumor grew, it wouldn't shut down the brain. Um, and when I'm talking to the doctor, it's on a Friday. I remember like literally the days and the hours, and I go, "Well, you want to do surgery on Monday?" And he goes, yeah. He says, because the tumors is that growing that quickly. I said, well, give me odds. He goes, 60-40. I go, wait a second. 60-40, you mean like there's a 40% chance that I won't have a kid on Monday afternoon? And he goes, no, 60% chance you won't have a kid on Monday afternoon. And I'm like, oh my God. I go, well, what if we don't do it? And he goes, 100% chance he's not here in 6 months. So you really don't, you kind of go on autopilot. And, we did it. He does, anyway, we go to the thing, and then he's at Children's Hospital in LA. They do the surgery, and it's like a 7.5 hour procedure, and they cut a hole in his head and stuff. And, the doctor comes out and says, listen, it went as good as we thought it could have gone. Um, we finished, the tube is in, and but we gave him enough tranquilizers to kind of knock him out for like 3, 4 days, because we don't want him touching his head, because they cut out the skull. And I said, well, I'll stay in the hospital. And he goes, you go home, because he's not going to wake up for 4 days. And I said, you know what? I'm more comfortable sleeping on the chair, or, when I'm here. And interestingly enough, the next day, I notice he's By this time, he had lost speech. He lost use of his right side of his body, and I mean, it was really a very aggressive tumor. And the next morning, I see him kind of wrestling in the bed when he's supposed to be out. And he just opens his eyes, looks at me, and in perfect English goes, "Dad, I'm effing starving. Get me sushi." And I like, something is really wrong here. And so I call them in and they go, "Look, we wish we knew what's going on, but he shouldn't be waking up." We said we gave him enough to put a horse out for 4 days. And so he ended up, he was supposed to go through 12, 24 weeks of chemo, 12, 24 weeks of radiation, all experimental. Excuse me. And he goes through the first two sessions of chemo, and we get called into the hospital, and the doctors fly out from New York. And at first I'm nervous, going, "Why are they calling me? It can only be bad news." So we go in the hospital, and the doctors just test John, and they go, "Listen, we don't know who your God is, but go home and thank him." And I go, "Well, what?" And he goes, "We thought we'd be able to shrink the tumor with the chemo and then blast it away with radiation." They go, "The tumor is gone." I go, "What do you mean?" He go, "It's not there anymore." They go, "We wish we could tell you why, but you know, thank your God, take your kid home, have a good life." But it changed, as a parent or as a human, it changes your perspective on what's really important. I mean, after you have a kid that goes through that, those 14-hour days, they look back and go, "You know what? I need to be spending more time with the family."
Thanks. And speaking of more time at home, what is it about cooking that helps you recharge, and what are some of your favorite cuisines to make?
Sure. Well, it's for me, everybody I know in Hollywood is in therapy, except me. Because for me, cooking is therapy. I mean, I could have the worst day in the world, and 6 o'clock, I go in the kitchen and make myself dinner, and it's kind of, I guess, that process of cutting and chopping and colors and plating and stuff like that just takes my mind over. By the time 8 o'clock comes around, I look back and go, "I can't believe I let blah blah blah, you know, get on me." And because if you leave a little bit of time before getting annoyed, typically you look back and go, "I don't know why that bothered me so much." But yeah, I've been cooking since I'm 12. My parents both worked, and my choice was learn how to cook or eat peanut butter and jelly for dinner every night. And so I just started cooking, and I would read my mom's cookbooks, and and I liked it, and I got good at it, and I cooked way better than my mom did. Um, but then when I was in college, I got a job working delivery in a Chinese restaurant in New York. And in New York, everybody gets takeout. And so I would always go in the kitchen. You pick up the bags, and this is way before Uber Eats or anything like that. And you pick up the bag and you bring it to someone's house, and then you go back to the kitchen, you pick up another bag, and you keep doing it. But the I would always ask the chefs to teach me how to cook certain Chinese dishes, and they just thought it was the funniest thing, teaching a Caucasian kid how to cook Chinese food. But then what happened was they were supposed to have a Chinese New Year party, and there was a big snowstorm, and three of the chefs didn't make it. And the head chef just looked at me and he went, "Could you cook with us?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, I could do that." So I ended up cooking in a Chinese restaurant for 2 years. I was like the only white boy in the kitchen. And so I learned how to cook Chinese, and then I really liked it. So my next college job was, I ended up cooking in an Italian restaurant and stuff. But then over the years, whenever I've kind of had the time, I've taken cooking classes with different people and stuff. And I literally, I buy a cookbook every month, and I cook the book. And again, for me, it's like it's not just eating it; it's the process of cooking it.
Thanks. Yeah, back in college, I accidentally set my face on fire with Breath of the Dragon when I was making stir fry. And it's when the pan is so hot that the oil catches
Oil, yeah,
fire. Yeah, It- wonderful, wonderful food. It's one of the most dangerous ways to cook, but it's a lot of
yeah.
fun.
Yeah, so
Um,
I pretty much could cook just about anything. My favorite cuisines go. I love cooking Chinese because it astounds people that I could cook Chinese food as good as any restaurant they've ever been in. And then Italian food, any Mediterranean food, Greek or something like that. These days I try and eat a little bit healthy. I wouldn't say a lot healthy, but a little bit. So, a lot of fish and salads and that kind of stuff.
Thanks. And so a lot of executives are getting bigger and bigger on sort of the health balance. And so, Jack Ma does Chen Tai Chi of Alibaba, and then Alex Karp of Plantier does it as well. And you've mentioned that as you grow older, you've started exercising an hour a day, 6 times a week, because you don't want to go out with a cane and everything else. And so, in terms of health and wellness, sort of how do you like to exercise, and what do you do in terms of your routine?
Well, I work out 6 days a week, and I give myself an hour because I found, even though sometimes I could clearly go beyond, I just found that if I stick to the hour, I can always find an hour in every day, so that I can't go, oh my God, I need an hour and a half to work out. An hour a day I could do, and sometimes I'll do in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes at night, but I can always find that 1 hour. So I stick to it, and I love lifting weights. And I do a lot. Literally, I do 6 days a week. I'll do some weights. I'll vary body parts, and then I do 20 minutes of cardio. So 40 minutes weights, 20 minutes cardio. I hate cardio, but you got to do it.
Yeah, there's a balance to anything. And so in terms of the gradual transformation of the way the media is being streamed, you've got miniature shows on Instagram, you've got full-length movies, and now the Oscars are going to be hosted on YouTube for, I believe this is 2028.
Yeah.
And so, with that in mind, sort of how do you see this gradual progression and crossover between the traditional media empire and then the influencer marketplace, sort of gradually evolving over the course of the next decade or so?
So, well, you at the end of the day, it's funny because people say to me, "Aren't you sad that television is dead?" And I'm going, depends on definition. I mean, I'm a storyteller. Quite honestly, I don't care if you watch it on a 60-inch TV or you watch it on a 5-inch cell phone. I mean, in China, 75% of the people that consume what I produce in China watch it on a cell phone. And we started doing, now the big rage here is vertical drama. Um, and, micro dramas, as they call them, and they're not invented in the US. We've been doing that stuff in China for 8 years now. And, so we've learned how to shoot vertical as opposed to the traditional horizontal. Um, but everybody keeps thinking that the whatever comes up is going to replace what came before it. And it really doesn't. I mean, when I got involved in cable, everybody said, "Oh, that's the downfall of television." And then I was in pay television. They go, "That's it. They can put the movie theaters out of business." It becomes part of the equation. It doesn't replace everything in the equation. I mean, all the vertical drama people are jumping up and down now and going, we're going to do it, and that's all that people are going to watch. I'm going, no. Sometimes I want to go home and sit in front of the TV and have a beer and let a 2 hour movie just kind of wash over me. Sometimes I want to watch TikToks. It's not this or that. It's all of those, and there's different ways of telling stories and different ways of chopping up a story. Now, serial drama is like the big rage and stuff. But people think it's something new, and I'm going, no, it's called soap operas. They've been around for 70 years now.
Thanks. And so, when you were first getting started, you essentially rolled out the trailer channel. So, the best 2 minutes of a $50 million budget. And so how did you go about sort of approaching, the executives getting that material and then sort of feeding it back and sort of charging for ads, if you don't mind me asking?
Sure. When I moved out from New York to LA, I was very young. I was 30 years old, and I got recruited to build what was then the biggest cable system in the country. build Los Angeles, which is going to be the first 61 channel two-way cable system ever built. And you're a New York kid and you're out in LA, and everybody, your neighbors and everybody is going to parties and premieres. And other than Detroit, which is all about the auto business, LA is simply about the entertainment business. I mean, either you're in it or your neighbors are in it, or something like that. So I would call it, I had 61 channels, and there weren't 61 channels in existence then. Um, and I would look at, the all these people going to parties. So I call up the studios and say, hey, could you put me on the list so I could go to those parties and the premieres? And they were like, you're more like a utility. You're like the gas company. No, we're not going to let you go. And I was having, I had character generators. I had the Lost Pet channel. I had the school lunch channel, the city government channel, just text on the screen, just to fill it up so there'd be something on the 61 channels. But then I met someone from Universal. And, right before that, um, I was always like toying with it. So I met someone from Universal who was in marketing. And I said, listen, I really don't understand. The best 2 minutes, the most effective marketing vehicle that you have for a movie is the movie trailer. I said, a lot of times the trailer is better than the movie. I said, the only time I ever see a movie trailer is when I'm in the movies. I said, wouldn't you want me to see that when I'm at home to make me want to go to the movie? And he said, yeah, but we can't afford it. I said, okay, tell you what. I said, I'll put those trailers on television. You invite me to the parties and the premieres. And he went, sure, we'll do that. So they would literally send me the trailers. And I hired a kid for $3 an hour. He edited them together. But then when we started doing audience polling, what's your favorite channel? People go, oh, I love MTV. I love CNN. I love that trailer channel. And I'm going, wait a second. I'm getting the best 2 minutes of a $50 million movie. Then movies were just 50. And people love it. And I filed it in the back of my head. But then the company that I worked for, which was Canadian, they sold out and moved back to Toronto. And they wanted me to go to, come up to Toronto. And I'm going, no, no, no. I said, I didn't go from New York to LA to go to Toronto. I said, I'm done with the cold. And so me and my friend Alan, I said, we got to think of something to keep us in. He was also from the East Coast. So we were playing with this idea. And, we said, we were thinking MTV of the movies. Because when you thought about it, back then, we looked at cable and said it's more like an electronic newspaper. You had CNN as the headline, ESPN as the sports page, Home Shopping Network is the ads. But what was conspicuously absent was the second most read section of any Sunday newspaper, which was the entertainment pages. So we said, great. I said, if MTV could stand a host in front of a green screen and go, Madonna has a new video, we could stand a host in front of a green screen and go, and Schwarzenegger has a new movie. Um, and I said, I know the studios and I know how to get the trailers and stuff like that. So, we just wrote a business plan. We thought we were really smart. Um, and people would look at it and go, you know what? It's actually not a bad idea, but people don't start TV networks. Only big media companies can start. You got to be Disney, you got to be Fox, and, you got to be Time Warner. And, while we like your idea, we don't believe anybody can start a TV network. But Alan and I just weren't smart enough to listen. So we just kept going until we eventually did it.
It played out well though, and the whole exodus between New York and Los Angeles that never ceases to amuse me. It seems like that the heart of the entertainment industry was founded on the migration from Broadway to Hollywood.
Yeah,
And so, speaking of that, so back in the day, you were beginning to launch but there was also television.com. And so television.com was a giant financial burn, but the entertainment and the television channels somehow compensated for that. And if you don't mind, can you like discuss that journey a little bit?
sure. We me and a few friends, we acquired the early days of the internet, and people were fighting over domain names, but we ended up getting the domain name television.com. And we were like, oh my God, that's so good. What do we do with it? But then people were buying up domain names. And somebody bought sex.com, I think, for like $8 million. And then we had somebody offer us $6 million for television.com. And we were like, no, 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 no. If sex.com is 8 million, television.com is 10 million. And they said, you're out of your mind. We're not going to pay you that, whatever. So we ended up keeping the domain, and we said, we're going to launch this as something all things television, and including streaming way before. I mean, at that time, technology was such that you could only have 6 frames a second. So people would kind of move like robots when you did it. But we were doing video, and people were fascinated and stuff. And the domain was so strong that when people would, look it up on a search engine, they plug in television, they would come to us because we'd come up first every time. But when we started it, TV advertising was going for about $25 per thousand viewers. And then the internet collapsed, I think in 98 or something like that. And the price dropped to 25 cents per thousand viewers. And here we are serving up video and costing us $1 every time somebody watches a video. So the more people that watched it, the more money we lost. And even to the point we were calling up the search engines and asking to be delisted, and they wouldn't delist us. So people would type in television. So eventually we just took it down because we were getting murdered, because the cost of serving this stuff up was not equal to what the cost of serving it was.
Okay. Um, and so is there anything that you wanted to discuss that I haven't asked yet?
Well, people have been after me to write a book for the longest time because there have been all kinds of, I mean, the e-stories. And I started a music festival in Russia with a guy named Vladimir Putin, as a charity for the Children's Hospital and the orphanage in St. Petersburg. We're the only media company uh, Western media company to be allowed to do media in China, which, is odd. So people have been always saying, Larry, you got to write a book, you got to write a book. And I wouldn't do it until last year. My daughter had a baby. And, I got 3 kids, and my kids are interesting because my boys are like their moms, very conservative. I mean, my oldest son, John, his mom, 12 years of Catholic school, never told a lie. You can't get John to do anything bad. My daughter, on the other hand, is a little more like me. She's kind of a wise ass, kind of got it all figured out. So she had a kid. So I got one grandkid. And I said, you know what? The last thing in the world I want is my grandchild to learn about grandpa from my daughter. I said, so I'm going to write a book so he could read it from my words. And so I wrote this book. It's called Off Script Recipes for Success. And it's interesting because you could kind of take my career and break it up into 8 different parts. So I wrote the anecdotes from each part of my career, but then I matched it with the recipes that inspired me there. So the book is somewhere between a memoir and a cookbook.
Thanks. And all right, so one of the last things I wanted to ask about is that, like, how much can you tell about somebody's true colors based on their television personality? Because you've spoken extensively about how, you know, Kim Kardashian does a reasonable amount of charitable work behind the scenes, but because that's not exactly what gets viewers really interested, it's not displayed on air as much.
Yeah. It's it always amazes me. People are like, "Oh my God, we got to watch Survivor tonight because Joe could fall off the cliff." And I'm going, guys, it's a TV show. There's 200 people there on the production crew. Believe me, they're not going to let them fall off the cliff. Um, People don't understand, even with the Kardashians, and I know that I've been friends with Bruce and Chris when Bruce was still Bruce, from literally the kids were babies. And yeah, I go, it's a TV show. I mean, if everything was going nice and everything was sweet, nobody would watch it. I mean, you need to have the drama there. So, when you get a show like Kardashians or Survivor, I mean, you're looking at probably 20 hours of TV footage that get edited down into 1 hour of TV. I said, and you're picking out the drama moments. You're not picking out the sweet moments. So people get confused. They just don't realize there's such a difference between the TV personality versus the real personality.
Thank you for doing this.
All righty, take care now.
I will.